The morning Kedra Thorne heard the first scream, she was suturing a 3-inch gash on a construction worker's forearm in the university medical clinic. The sound pierced through the sterile walls like broken glass, not the familiar cry of pain she'd grown accustomed to during her years as an army medic, but something primal, desperate, and utterly wrong. Her hands, steady from countless battlefield wounds, never faltered as she completed the final stitch, but her eyes found the window overlooking the campus quad. Outside, students walked between classes under the October sun, their backpacks heavy with the weight of ordinary concerns. None of them noticed the figure stumbling from behind the library, its gait too jerky, too purposeless. Kedra's trained eye caught the wrongness immediately, the way the person's head lolled at an unnatural angle, the dark stain spreading across torn clothing. She'd seen enough combat casualties to recognize death, but this thing was still moving. "Doc, you okay?" The construction worker, a burly man named Rodriguez, followed her gaze. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Kedra forced her attention back to bandaging his arm, but another scream erupted from somewhere closer. Then another. The sound multiplied like an echo chamber of nightmares, and through the window she watched as panic spread across the quad like wildfire. Students dropped their books and ran, some toward the dormitories, others toward the parking lots. The stumbling figure had become 3, then 7, then too many to count. Her radio crackled to life, emergency dispatch calling all medical personnel to the hospital. But Kedra's instincts, honed by tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, told her that conventional medicine wouldn't help with whatever was happening outside. She grabbed her tactical medical bag, the one she'd never quite brought herself to retire, and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" Rodriguez called after her, but she was already moving. The hallways of the medical building had transformed into rivers of chaos. Faculty and staff pressed against windows, their faces pale with confusion and fear. Kedra pushed through them, her combat training taking over as she assessed threats and escape routes. The main entrance was clogged with people trying to leave, so she diverted toward the emergency exit that led to the engineering building. That's where she first saw Ezekiel Voss, a lanky graduate student with premature gray streaking his black hair, frantically trying to unlock a secured lab door. His hands shook as he swiped his access card repeatedly, cursing in what sounded like German mixed with English. "The locks are all electronic," he muttered without looking up as Kedra approached. "If the power grid goes down, we'll be trapped like rats." "Why would the power go down?" Kedra asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. Zeke finally looked at her, his dark eyes wide behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Because whatever's happening out there, it's not isolated. I've been monitoring emergency frequencies. Similar reports from Chicago, Detroit, Boston. The whole eastern seaboard is lighting up with distress calls." A crash from somewhere below them made them both freeze. Glass shattering, then screaming that cut off abruptly. Kedra's hand instinctively went to her hip, where her service weapon would have been years ago. Now she carried only medical supplies and the burden of keeping people alive. "We need to get to higher ground," she said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone that had once commanded respect in field hospitals. "Away from the main flow of people." Zeke nodded, abandoning his attempts at the lab door. "The observatory. Top floor of the physics building. It's isolated, defensible, and has its own emergency power system." They moved together through corridors that grew quieter as they climbed, the sounds of chaos fading below them but never disappearing entirely. Through the windows they could see smoke rising from various points across the campus. Cars abandoned in the middle of roads. Bodies that no longer moved like bodies should. As they reached the observatory level, Kedra caught sight of movement in the stairwell behind them. A young woman with long black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail was helping an elderly man climb the steps. Behind them came a teenage girl with bright purple streaks in her brown hair, and bringing up the rear, a broad-shouldered man in chef's whites who kept glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Looks like we're not the only ones with the same idea," Zeke observed. Kedra studied the approaching group, automatically cataloging their conditions, capabilities, potential value to a survival situation. The woman appeared calm and organized, the old man moved with surprising determination, the teenager had the alertness of someone used to watching for trouble, and the chef carried a large knife with comfortable familiarity. "Good," Kedra said. "We're going to need all the help we can get." The observatory felt like a sanctuary perched above the chaos, its domed ceiling and wall of windows offering a panoramic view of a world gone mad. Kedra watched the 5 strangers assess their surroundings with the wariness of people who understood that safety was now a temporary luxury. The young woman with the ponytail immediately moved to the windows, studying exit routes and blind spots with tactical awareness that impressed the former medic. "I'm Nalani Reeves," the woman said, turning back to the group. "High school social studies teacher, or at least I was until about an hour ago." Her voice carried the controlled calm of someone accustomed to managing crisis situations, even if those had previously involved unruly teenagers rather than reanimated corpses. The elderly man lowered himself carefully into a chair, his breathing labored but steady. Despite his age, his eyes remained sharp and calculating. "Tobias Crane, Professor Emeritus of Medieval History. I've spent 40 years studying how civilizations collapse." He gestured toward the windows. "I just never expected to witness it firsthand." The teenager with purple-streaked hair was already examining the observatory's equipment with curious fingers. "Solara Jean. I was supposed to be in chemistry lab when all this started." She paused, looking up at the adults surrounding her. "My parents work at the CDC. They always said if something like this happened, get to high ground and wait for official response." Her voice cracked slightly on the word parents. The man in chef's white stepped forward, still gripping his knife. "Dimitri Blackwood. I run the kitchen at Rossini's downtown." His Russian accent was thick but his English precise. "I've butchered enough meat to know what death looks like. What's down there isn't death, it's something else." Zeke moved to the computer terminal, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "I'm picking up scattered radio transmissions. Military frequencies are mostly static, but there are civilian emergency broadcasts from multiple cities. Whatever this is, it's spreading fast." Nalani joined him at the terminal, her teacher's instincts kicking in as she processed information. "We need to establish priorities. Food, water, communication, and defensible positions. This building has advantages, limited access points, good visibility, and if Zeke's right about the emergency power, we can maintain basic systems." Kedra found herself studying Nalani with growing respect. The woman was thinking like a soldier, planning for extended conflict rather than hoping for quick rescue. "What about family?" she asked the group. "People you need to reach?" Solara's face crumpled briefly before she composed herself. "My parents are in Atlanta. If they're alive, they know I'd try to get somewhere safe." Tobias shook his head slowly. His wife had passed years ago, his children lived overseas. Dimitri's jaw tightened. "My brother lives in Boston. Haven't been able to reach him." "My sister's in California," Nalani added quietly. "Phone networks are down." Zeke looked up from the terminal. "I've got bad news and worse news." "Bad news? Emergency services are overwhelmed." "Worse news, the infection appears to be transmitted through bites, and the incubation period varies from minutes to hours." The weight of that information settled over the group like a heavy blanket. Through the windows, they could see figures moving across the campus below with that same jerky, unnatural gait Kedra had first noticed from the medical clinic. Some wore university uniforms, others the casual clothes of students who would never graduate. "How many rounds of ammunition do we have?" Dimitri asked pragmatically. "None," Kedra replied. "This is a university, not a military base." "Then we think like our ancestors," Tobias said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had studied human survival across centuries. "Before gunpowder, before modern medicine, people survived plagues and invasions with preparation, cooperation, and careful resource management." Solara looked up from where she'd been examining a chemistry storage cabinet. "There are chemicals here that could be useful. Basic compounds for making disinfectants, maybe even simple explosives if we need them." Nalani was sketching a rough map of the building on a whiteboard. "We need to secure the stairwells first. Create choke points we can defend. Then inventory everything useful, food, medical supplies, tools, anything that could be weaponized." Over the next several hours, they worked with the efficiency of people who understood that preparation meant survival. Dimitri's kitchen experience proved invaluable as he cataloged their limited food supplies and calculated rationing needs. Zeke rigged motion sensors at key access points using equipment from the physics labs. Solara mixed basic chemical deterrents while Tobias shared knowledge about siege warfare that seemed absurdly relevant. Kedra found herself moving between tasks, her medical training making her the default leader for their small band of survivors. As darkness fell over the campus, she stood at the windows watching fires burn across the city. The infected seemed more active at night, their movements coordinated in ways that suggested something more than random hunger. "It's not just a disease," she said quietly as the others gathered around her. "They're hunting. Learning." Nalani joined her at the window. "Then we'd better learn faster." Below them, something that had once been human turned its face toward the observatory, as if it had heard their voices across the distance and darkness. For a moment, Kidra could have sworn it smiled. The first real test came at dawn on their third day, when the infected finally discovered the stairwells weren't truly impassable. Kidra woke to the soft chime of Zeke's improvised alarm system, a sound that immediately sent ice through her veins. The motion sensors had detected movement on the 5th floor, 2 levels below their position. "How many?" she whispered, moving to where Zeke monitored his equipment with grim concentration. "At least 6, maybe more. They've figured out how to open doors." His voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd spent 3 sleepless nights expecting exactly this moment. The group had drilled for this scenario, but facing it in reality felt entirely different. Dimitri gripped his knife while Nalani hefted a fire axe they'd found in the emergency equipment closet. Solara clutched a bottle of her homemade chemical deterrent, her young face set with determination that broke Kidra's heart. Tobias, despite his age, held a sharpened metal rod with steady hands. "Remember the plan?" Nalani said softly. "Fallback positions. No heroes. We survive together or not at all." The first infected creature to reach their floor had once been a janitor. His university ID badge still hung from a shirt now stained with substances Kidra didn't want to identify. Behind him came others, a student wearing a torn homecoming dress, a security guard missing half his face, a professor Tobias recognized from faculty meetings. "Professor Williams," Tobias whispered, genuine grief in his voice. "He has grandchildren." The infected moved with coordinated purpose now, spreading out to cover multiple approach angles. Their movements had evolved from the stumbling chaos of the first day into something more calculated, more terrifying. They'd learned to hunt as a pack. Zeke's electrical barriers activated first, sending crackling energy across the doorframe. 2 of the infected recoiled, but the others pressed forward through the pain, their flesh smoking but their advance never slowing. Solara's chemical compounds created a choking cloud that bought them precious seconds, but the creatures adapted, breathing through damaged throats and pressing on. The first real violence erupted when the security guard lunged at Dimitri with inhuman speed. The chef's kitchen training served him well. His knife found vital targets with practiced precision. But what should have been killing blows merely slowed the creature down. Black blood splattered across the floor as Dimitri fought for his life against something that felt no pain and feared no death. Nalani's fire axe swept in a wide arc, connecting with the homecoming queen's skull in a spray of gore that painted the wall behind her. The teacher's face went pale, but her grip on the weapon never wavered. She'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and they all knew it. Kidra found herself facing Professor Williams, his familiar face now a mask of rage and hunger. Her medical training screamed against causing harm, but survival instinct proved stronger. She drove her improvised spear deep into his chest, then again into his neck when the first blow failed to stop him. "The head!" Solara shouted from where she'd retreated to mix more chemicals. "You have to destroy the brain." The revelation changed everything. Dimitri's next strike found the security guard's temple with a sickening crunch. Nalani's axe split the homecoming queen's skull cleanly in half. Tobias, with surprising strength, drove his metal rod through the janitor's eye socket and into his brain. When the last infected body finally stopped moving, the observatory fell into awful silence. 6 people who'd been alive and human just days ago now lay scattered across the floor in pieces. The smell of death and chemical smoke filled the air, making them all gag. Solara was the first to break down, her teenage composure finally cracking as she sobbed into her hands. Nalani wrapped protective arms around the girl, her own tears falling silently. Dimitri sat heavily against a wall, staring at his blood-stained knife with hollow eyes. Tobias moved among the bodies with academic detachment, but his hands shook as he checked each one for any sign of continued animation. "We can't stay here," Kidra said, forcing herself to think tactically despite the horror. "If 6 found us, more will follow. This position is compromised." Zeke was already at his radio equipment, scanning frequencies with desperate intensity. "I'm picking up a strong signal from the medical district. Coordinates for a survivor gathering point at Mercy General Hospital." "Hospital means medical supplies," Kidra noted. "But it also means that's where people took their infected loved ones in the early days. So it's either salvation or a death trap," Nalani said, helping Solara to her feet. Dimitri stood slowly, wiping his knife clean on a piece of torn fabric. "In Stalingrad, my grandfather learned that sometimes death trap is only option left. Better to die fighting toward hope than hide and wait for death to find you." Tobias nodded solemnly. "History teaches us that civilizations fall, but humans endure. We adapt, we move, we survive. They spent the next hour gathering their few possessions and destroying anything that might be useful to other infected who found this place. Zeke rigged his remaining electronics into a makeshift early warning system, while Solara distributed her remaining chemical weapons among the group. As they prepared to leave the observatory that had sheltered them for 3 days, Kedra took one last look at the view that had shown them the collapse of their world. Smoke still rose from distant fires, but there were also signs of life, survivor groups moving between buildings, emergency lights flashing in coordinated patterns, the persistence of human intelligence and cooperation. "You know," she said to the group as they prepared to descend into uncertainty, "maybe we're not just surviving. Maybe we're starting to live again." Nalani squeezed her shoulder. "Heroes rise from ashes, right? They left the bodies behind, carrying only the knowledge that they could kill when they had to, love when they needed to, and face tomorrow because they refused to accept that yesterday was the end of everything." The journey to Mercy General Hospital took them through the transformed landscape of their city, where familiar streets had become alien territories marked by abandoned vehicles and the shambling forms of the infected. Kedra led the group through back alleys and maintenance tunnels, her military training invaluable as they navigated around the larger hordes that seemed to gather near any source of noise or movement. They traveled light and fast, taking only essential supplies. Dimitri had fashioned a crude spear from a mop handle and kitchen knife, while Nalani carried her blood-stained fire axe like a medieval warrior. Solara's backpack clinked softly with chemical supplies, and Tobias surprised them all by producing a walking stick that concealed a sword blade, a gift from a former student who'd known his professor's fascination with medieval weapons. Zeke monitored radio frequencies as they moved, adjusting their route based on reports of infected concentrations and survivor activity. His equipment crackled with fragments of communication from various groups scattered across the city, painting a picture of humanity's desperate struggle to maintain civilization's flickering flame. The hospital rose before them like a fortress of hope and terror combined. The emergency lights still functioned, powered by backup generators that cast everything in an eerie red glow. Vehicles surrounded the building. Ambulances, police cars, and civilian cars abandoned in panic during the early days of the outbreak. Bodies littered the parking lot, some clearly infected, others bearing the injuries of people who'd fought to defend this place. "Movement on the roof," Solara whispered, pointing to where figures in military fatigues maintained watch positions behind makeshift barriers. A spotlight suddenly blazed to life, pinning them in its harsh white beam. A voice boomed through a megaphone, professionally calm but unmistakably authoritative. "Stop where you are. Drop any weapons and state your business." Kedra stepped forward, raising her hands but keeping her posture confident. 6 survivors seeking shelter. Former Army medic Kedra Thorne, along with 5 civilians. "We're uninfected and able to contribute." After a tense moment, the spotlight dimmed slightly. "Approach the main entrance slowly. Any sudden movements will be met with force." The lobby had been transformed into a military checkpoint complete with barricades, weapon stations, and examination areas. Soldiers in combat gear directed them through a decontamination process that involved chemical sprays, temperature checks, and blood samples. The efficiency was impressive, but Kedra noted the hollow eyes and tense movements of people operating on the edge of exhaustion. Commander Sarah Vex emerged from behind the security station, her uniform crisp despite the circumstances, her auburn hair pulled back in a regulation bun that somehow remained perfect even in the apocalypse. She studied their group with the calculating gaze of someone who'd seen too much death and trusted too little hope. "You're lucky to have made it this far," she said, reviewing their medical test results on a tablet. "Most civilian groups don't last 3 days outside secured zones." "We had advantages," Nalani replied diplomatically. "Training, defensible position, and good teamwork." Commander Vex led them deeper into the hospital, past treatment areas where soldiers and civilians worked side by side treating injuries and managing supplies. The facility housed nearly 200 survivors, a mix of military personnel, medical staff, and refugees who'd found their way to this sanctuary. "We maintain strict protocols here," Vex explained as they walked. "Everyone contributes according to their abilities. No free rides, no exceptions. The infected are learning, adapting, and we can't afford weakness in our ranks." They were assigned quarters in a converted patient room with 4 beds and a small adjoining bathroom. Luxury compared to the observatory, but Kedra noticed the reinforced door and single small window that could serve as either protection or trap depending on circumstances. Over the following days, they integrated into the hospital's survival community. Kedra worked in the medical bay, her combat experience invaluable in treating injuries that conventional medicine rarely encountered. Dmitri joined the food preparation team, stretching limited supplies with creative efficiency. Nalani took charge of organizing civilian labor and maintaining morale. Solara worked with the hospital's remaining chemistry equipment to develop better weapons and defenses. Tobias proved unexpectedly valuable as an intelligence analyst, his historical knowledge helping predict infected behavior patterns. Zeke found himself working closely with Commander Vex's communications team, and it was during one of these sessions that he overheard something that changed everything. Late at night, when most of the facility slept, he monitored emergency frequencies and picked up encrypted military transmissions discussing Operation Clean Slate. The fragments he decoded were horrifying. Plans to establish green zones for uninfected populations while systematically bombing red zones, where infection rates exceeded acceptable parameters. The city they called home was scheduled for sterilization in 72 hours. When he shared this information with their group, the reaction was immediate and divided. Some wanted to confront Commander Vex directly, demanding answers and evacuation assistance. Others argued for immediate escape, believing that military cooperation was impossible once they knew about the bombing. "She's been honest with us about everything else," Nalani argued. "Maybe she doesn't know, or maybe she's trying to figure out how to save as many people as possible. Or maybe she's been stalling until the bombers arrive," Dmitri countered grimly. "In Russia, we learn not to trust anyone in uniform when survival is at stake." Kedra found herself torn between her military background and her growing attachment to this makeshift family. She understood the cold calculus behind Operation Clean Slate: sacrifice the few to save the many, but she also knew that the people in this hospital deserved better than becoming acceptable losses in someone else's strategic plan. The decision was taken away from them when alarms began blaring throughout the facility. Through the reinforced windows, they could see waves of infected emerging from storm drains and building ruins, moving with coordinated purpose toward the hospital. The final assault had begun, and with it, their time was running out in more ways than one. Commander Vex's voice echoed through the intercom system: "All personnel to defensive positions. This is not a drill." As Kedra grabbed her medical kit and prepared to fight for their sanctuary, she wondered if they were about to become heroes or simply the latest casualties in humanity's struggle against extinction. The infected assault on Mercy General began at dawn with terrifying coordination. Unlike the random shambling hordes they'd encountered before, these creatures moved with military precision, attacking from multiple directions simultaneously while others emerged from the hospital's own basement levels. Kedra realized with growing horror that the infected had been infiltrating the building for days, perhaps weeks, using maintenance tunnels and abandoned sections to position themselves for this moment. Commander Vex's voice crackled through the intercom as explosion after explosion rocked the building's foundations. "Basement levels compromised. All units fall back to floors 3 through 7. Initiate lockdown protocols." But as Kedra moved through the chaos, treating wounded soldiers and civilians, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Some of the attack patterns were too sophisticated, too perfectly timed. The infected were hitting weak points that should have been known only to the military personnel who'd fortified this place. Zeke appeared at her side, his face pale with more than fear. "I intercepted Commander Vex's communications with higher command. Operation Clean Slate has been moved up. The bombers are inbound in 6 hours, not 72. 6 hours? Nalani had approached from behind, blood splattered across her teacher's clothes from helping evacuate wounded civilians. "That's barely enough time to organize an evacuation." "Unless evacuation was never the plan," Dmitri said grimly, emerging from a stairwell with his improvised spear dripping infected blood. "I've been monitoring their supply movements. They've been reducing medical stocks, food reserves, everything except ammunition. Someone's been preparing to abandon this place." The horrible truth crystallized as Solara joined them, her young face streaked with tears and soot. "I overheard some soldiers talking. They said the infected breakthrough was right on schedule. Like they were expecting it." Kedra felt the weight of betrayal settle over her like a lead blanket. Her military training screamed against believing that fellow soldiers would sacrifice civilians for tactical advantage, but the evidence was overwhelming. Commander Vex had been using the hospital as bait, gathering infected forces for elimination while keeping her real forces safely positioned for extraction. The realization was confirmed when they reached the 4th floor and found it eerily quiet. The military personnel who should have been defending this level were gone, their equipment cleared out except for obsolete gear that looked like it had been left deliberately. Through the windows, they could see helicopters lifting off from the hospital's roof, carrying away the bulk of the military contingent. "We've been played," Tobias said with the bitter wisdom of someone who'd studied human nature across centuries. Classic strategic sacrifice. Gather your enemies in one location, then eliminate the location. The remaining defenders were a mixture of medical staff, low-ranking soldiers, and civilians who'd been deemed non-essential for evacuation. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the head of emergency medicine, had barricaded herself in the surgical suite with a dozen patients too injured to move. When Kedra's group found her, the doctor's hands shook with exhaustion and rage. "They took the blood supplies," Dr. Vasquez said without preamble. "The plasma, the antibiotics, everything we need to treat survivors. Left us with gauze and aspirin while they flew away to safety." The infected were now pouring through the lower levels in waves, their coordination suggesting not just intelligence but communication. Worse, some of them moved with the fluid grace of recent converts, people who'd been turned within hours rather than days, retaining more of their human cognitive abilities. "There," Solara pointed through a window at figures moving in the parking lot below. "Look at how they're organizing the others." The recently infected were indeed directing their more deteriorated counterparts, pointing toward specific entrances and weak points with disturbing tactical awareness. Among them, Kedra recognized Commander Vex's distinctive silhouette, but something was wrong with her movements, too jerky, too aggressive. "She's been turned," Zeke breathed. But she's still smart enough to remember the building's layout. The betrayal was complete. Not only had the military abandoned them, but their former commander had become the enemy's most dangerous asset. The infected now had detailed knowledge of every defensive position, every escape route, every vulnerability in their makeshift fortress. With the lower floors overrun and their ammunition running low, the surviving defenders fell back to the hospital's top level. 37 people crowded into the pediatric ward, using overturned beds and medical equipment to create barricades. Among them were nurses who'd refused to abandon their patients, soldiers who'd discovered their orders too late, and civilians who'd believed in the promise of sanctuary. Dr. Vasquez worked frantically to treat the wounded while Nalani organized the defense. Dimitri and several others used whatever weapons they could improvise, while Solara prepared her remaining chemical compounds for a final stand. Tobias, despite his age, helped coordinate communications with other survivor groups across the city. Outside, they could hear the infected climbing the stairwells, their moans and snarls echoing through the building like a rising tide of death. Zeke's radio picked up the distant rumble of approaching aircraft, the bombers that would end everything in just hours. "We need an extraction plan," Kedra said, but even as she spoke, she knew their options were impossibly limited. The roof had been mined by the departing military, the stairwells were compromised, and their numbers included too many injured people to attempt a running evacuation. "Maybe," Nalani said quietly, "extraction isn't the only option." She was looking at the hospital's emergency broadcast system, its red emergency lights still blinking faithfully. If they couldn't escape, perhaps they could at least warn others about the betrayal, about Operation Clean Slate, about the truth of what was happening. As the infected began their final assault on their position, Kedra realized that their role in this story might not be as survivors, but as witnesses. Heroes sometimes rose from ashes not by living through the fire, but by ensuring that others would remember why the flames burned. The sound of breaking glass echoed from the stairwell, and Commander Vex's distorted voice called out to them, "Come out, little soldiers. Time to join the winning side." The pediatric ward became a fortress of desperation as 37 souls prepared to make their final stand against an enemy that wore familiar faces. Kedra moved between the injured, dispensing morphine and comfort in equal measure while her tactical mind calculated angles of attack and ammunition counts. They had perhaps 20 minutes before the infected breached their barricades, and less than 4 hours before the bombers arrived to erase all evidence of humanity's failure. Nalani had taken command of their ragtag defense force with the natural authority of someone accustomed to managing chaos. She positioned the wounded in the center of their perimeter, surrounded by anyone capable of fighting. Dr. Vasquez continued her work with steady hands, refusing to acknowledge that some of her patients would not survive the next hour regardless of her skill. "Radio still working," Zeke reported from where he'd jury-rigged their communication system. "I'm broadcasting our situation on all emergency frequencies. If there are other survivor groups out there, they need to know about Operation Clean Slate." Solara had distributed her remaining chemical weapons among the defenders, turning ordinary medical supplies into makeshift weapons. Bottles of sanitizer became incendiary devices, cleaning chemicals transformed into toxic clouds, and even the oxygen tanks could serve as explosive charges if necessary. Her teenage ingenuity had given them tools, but everyone understood these would only delay the inevitable. Dmitri sharpened kitchen knives on a whetstone he'd found in maintenance, his movements methodical and calming. In Stalingrad, he told a frightened nurse working beside him, "My grandfather said the difference between heroes and cowards was not fear, but what you do despite the fear." Tobias had positioned himself near the windows, his concealed sword drawn and gleaming in the emergency lighting. Despite his age, his grip remained steady as he watched for movement in the stairwells. Throughout history, he said to no one in particular, the greatest victories often came from those who refused to surrender when surrender seemed rational. The first infected to breach their perimeter was a young orderly named Marcus, someone who'd shared lunch with half the people now preparing to kill him. His hospital scrubs were torn and blood-stained, but his ID badge still hung from his pocket, a grim reminder of the humanity they were forced to destroy. Nalani's fire axe ended his advance with brutal efficiency, but behind him came a wave of others. The recently infected moved with terrible purpose, using their retained memories to exploit weaknesses in the defense. Former security guards knew which doors could be forced, ex-nurses understood the layout of emergency exits, and turned patients remembered every hiding place. The battle devolved into savage close combat as the infected overwhelmed their outer defenses. Kedra found herself fighting beside a janitor who wielded a mop bucket like a shield, while a physical therapist used his knowledge of human anatomy to strike at vulnerable points with surgical precision. The professional boundaries that had once defined their relationships dissolved in the face of shared survival. Dr. Vasquez never stopped working, even as infected creatures pressed closer to her patients. When a turned surgical resident lunged at a child under her care, she drove a bone saw through his temple without hesitation, then returned to suturing as if violence was simply another medical procedure. Solara's chemicals bought them precious minutes, but her supply was finite. As her last smoke grenade dispersed, she grabbed a scalpel and stood beside the adults who'd become her chosen family. At 16, she was no longer a child but a warrior forged in the crucible of humanity's darkest hour. Zeke's radio crackled with responses from across the city. Other survivor groups acknowledged their warnings about the bombing, changing evacuation plans and spreading word about the military's betrayal. Their sacrifice was becoming a beacon that might save thousands of others, even if they couldn't save themselves. The breakthrough came when Commander Vex herself appeared in the doorway, her military bearing intact despite the infection that had claimed her. She moved with fluid grace, directing her undead soldiers with gestures and guttural commands that retained the authority of her former rank. "Medic Thorn," she spoke, her voice a distorted mockery of human speech. "You always were too idealistic. Join us and the pain stops. Fight and watch everyone you care about die slowly." Kedra stepped forward, her improvised spear steady in her hands. "I took an oath to do no harm, Commander. But that was before I understood what harm really looked like." The final assault came from all directions simultaneously. Infected poured through windows they'd broken from the outside, burst through barricades that could no longer hold, and emerged from vents and maintenance areas that the military's intelligence had revealed to their turned commander. But the defenders had transformed as well. No longer doctors, teachers, students, or chefs, they had become something new. People who chose to fight for strangers because those strangers were all they had left of the world worth saving. They formed a tight circle around the wounded, each person's back protected by someone who'd become family through shared trauma. Dmitri fell first, overwhelmed while defending a nurse and her infant patient. His last act was to trigger one of Solara's explosive devices, taking 6 infected down with him. Tobias followed, his medieval sword flashing in graceful arcs until a turned doctor grabbed his wrist and the infection found new prey. Dr. Vasquez died protecting her operating table, her surgical skills turned to deadly purpose as she fought with scalpels in both hands. Zeke's final transmission went out as infected teeth found his throat, warning everyone within radio range that the bombing would commence in 90 minutes. As their circle contracted, Kedra found herself standing with Nalani and Solara, the 3 survivors who'd become sisters in this crucible of loss. Around them lay the bodies of heroes who'd chosen to fight rather than flee, to protect rather than abandon, to rise from ashes even as those ashes consumed them. "The bombers," Solara whispered as the sound of approaching aircraft grew louder. "At least it'll be quick." Nalani reached for her hands and Kedra completed the triangle. "We saved people today," the teacher said quietly. "Our warnings got out. Others will survive because we fought." Through the windows, they could see the aircraft circling into attack formation, their payload ready to erase this failed sanctuary from existence. But across the city, emergency lights flashed in coordinated patterns as survivor groups evacuated based on their warnings. The sacrifice had meaning beyond their small circle of defiance. Commander Vex approached with measured steps, her infected features twisted into something that might have been respect. "Heroes," she said in her distorted voice. "Always so beautiful in their futility." As the first bombs began to fall, Kedra closed her eyes and thought about the people who would live because she had chosen to die. In the end, perhaps that was what separated heroes from survivors. Not the ability to live through the fire, but the willingness to burn so others wouldn't have to. 6 months after the bombing of Mercy General Hospital, the memorial garden grew in the ruins where heroes had made their final stand. Wildflowers pushed through cracked concrete, fed by soil enriched with the ashes of both the fallen and their enemies. The city had stabilized, not healed, perhaps never truly healed, but found a way to continue existing in the spaces between destruction and hope. Elena Martinez knelt among the flowers, her weathered hands placing fresh blooms at the small monument that bore 7 names: Kedra Thorne, Nalani Reeves, Solara Jean, Dimitri Blackwood, Tobias Crane, Ezekiel Voss, and Dr. Elena Vasquez. Beside each name was carved a simple phrase: "They warned us all." Elena had been the radio operator at a survivor compound 15 miles outside the city when Zeke's final transmission reached them. His crackling voice had carried across the airwaves with desperate urgency, warning of Operation Clean Slate and providing coordinates for safe evacuation routes. Her group of 43 people had escaped the bombing because 7 strangers chose to broadcast truth instead of silence in their final moments. Now she served as coordinator for the Memorial Garden Project, one of dozens of similar sites across the recovered territories. Each memorial honored local heroes who died protecting others during the dark months of the outbreak. The garden at Mercy General had become something more, a pilgrimage site for survivors who understood the weight of inherited hope. Marcus Chen, age 17, crouched beside Elena as they planted new seedlings. He'd been a sophomore in high school when the outbreak began, surviving the initial chaos by hiding in his family's storm shelter. When he finally emerged weeks later, his parents were gone, his neighborhood was rubble, and the world had moved on without him. The memorial gardens gave him purpose, a way to honor the dead while nurturing new life. "Tell me again about the radio messages," he said as he worked. It had become ritual, this sharing of stories that preserved truth better than any monument could. Elena smiled, her voice taking on the cadence of someone who'd told this story many times. The first transmission came at 0347 hours, Eastern Standard Time. Static cleared, and this voice, exhausted, terrified, but absolutely determined, began broadcasting warnings about military evacuation plans and bombing schedules. She gestured toward the rubble that still marked the hospital's former location. They could have used their final minutes trying to escape, or begging for rescue that would never come. Instead, they chose to save people they'd never met. The government's official records remained classified, but survivor networks had pieced together fragments of the truth over the months that followed. Operation Clean Slate had been real, its scope breathtaking in its calculated brutality. 47 major population centers had been designated for sterilization, their infected populations to be eliminated along with any survivors who couldn't be evacuated in time. The warnings from Mercy General had changed everything. Survivor groups across the region received advance notice, abandoning compromised positions and spreading word through underground networks that the government couldn't monitor. Thousands of people lived because 7 strangers had chosen to become witnesses instead of victims. Dr. Sarah Kim approached through the garden paths, her medical bag slung over one shoulder and a tablet computer in her hand. She'd been documenting survivor accounts for the historical archive, collecting testimonies before memory faded and truth became legend. Her work had revealed the scope of heroism during those dark months. Teachers who'd protected students, doctors who'd stayed with patients, ordinary people who'd performed extraordinary acts simply because those acts needed performing. "New testimony came in this morning," she said, settling beside Elena and Marcus. A group in Phoenix confirmed they received Ezekiel Voss's technical specifications for early warning systems. They've been using his designs to protect 3 separate settlements. Elena nodded, unsurprised. In the months since the bombing, they discovered that Zeke's final broadcasts included more than just warnings. Embedded in his emergency transmissions were technical specifications, medical protocols, and tactical information that had proven invaluable to survivor communities. Even in death, his engineering genius continued protecting the living. A new voice joined their conversation as Amy Rodriguez emerged from the memorial's small visitor center. She'd been a construction worker before the outbreak, one of the fortunate few who'd evacuated early and survived to help rebuild. Now she managed the memorial site, ensuring that visitors understood both the history and the hope that grew from this sacred ground. "School groups arriving in an hour," she reported. 40 kids from the New Haven settlement. Their teacher wants them to understand what sacrifice really means. Elena stood, brushing soil from her hands. Teaching the next generation had become her primary mission, ensuring that the lessons learned in blood and terror weren't lost to the comfort of recovered civilization. These children were growing up in a world where humanity had faced extinction and chosen to endure. They deserved to know the price of their safety. The memorial garden had become more than a monument to the dead. It served as a school where survivors shared practical knowledge: Dimitri's food preservation techniques, Nalani's organizational methods, Solara's chemical innovations, and Kedra's field medicine protocols. The heroes' expertise lived on in the skills they'd passed to others during their final days. As afternoon faded toward evening, Elena walked the garden paths one final time before heading home to her small apartment in the rebuilt district. The flowers released their fragrance into the cooling air, a sweet counterpoint to the lingering smell of concrete dust and regrowth. In the distance, she could see lights beginning to twinkle in the settlements that had sprouted from the ruins. At the central monument, she paused to read the inscription that visitors often overlooked. "Heroes rise from ashes not because they survive the fire, but because they choose to light the way for others, even as the flames consume them." Below that, in smaller text, was a line that Solara Jean had spray-painted on a wall during their final hours: "The future remembers what we do in the dark." Elena touched the names carved in stone, feeling the weight of inherited responsibility. These 7 strangers had become family to thousands of people who'd never met them, their sacrifice binding together a community of survivors who understood that hope was something you built rather than something you found. As she walked home through streets where children played and vendors sold fresh produce from rooftop gardens, Elena carried with her the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new challenges. The infected still wandered in the wilderness beyond the settlements, and rumors spoke of communities where power-hungry leaders exploited fear for personal gain. But tonight, in the memorial garden where wildflowers grew from ashes, the dead kept watch over the living. Their legacy wasn't carved in stone but lived in the heartbeat of a civilization that had chosen to remember its heroes by becoming worthy of their sacrifice. In the end, Elena reflected, perhaps that was the truest form of resurrection, not returning the dead to life, but ensuring that their deaths gave meaning to the lives that followed. Heroes rose from ashes by teaching others how to build with fire instead of being consumed by it. The memorial garden would bloom again tomorrow, fed by the soil of memory and tended by hands that remembered why it mattered to keep growing, even in the shadow of extinction.